He's mostly awake and ready to rumble. It's the Michael Duke Show every weekday morning on AM 700 KBYR and Oldies 102.1.
Yeah, mostly awake. Mostly. The Michael Duke Show. Your home for Common Sense Radio. Thanks for coming in and joining us. All right, what do we got? A couple final segments. We're about to talk with Tom Harris, who is the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition and the former executive director of the National Resources Stewardship Project. The ICSC talks a lot about some of the fallacies that we hear about climate change, global warming, try to hit back with some things like facts and discussions and talking points. I'm sure that they've been branded as heretics by about 15 different, organizations that are all in favor of spending billions of dollars on climate change. But I imagine they probably wear that as a badge of pride. Tom Harris comes in to talk about the new assertions from the IPCC, which I'm sure sounds a lot like we're all going to die. Good morning, Tom. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. How are you, Michael?
Not too bad, not too bad. So, is that it, Tom? Are we all going to die? Is that kind of the how this is all going to work out?
Well, in fact, the IPCC on Monday opened up for comment a new report on what's going to happen to the world when we hit 1.5 degrees warming, and it gets warmer and warmer. The trouble is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the IPCC, they're no longer what they were when they were created. When they were created in 1988, their purpose was to examine all climate change, including natural. But then along came the Rio Conference, the Earth Summit in 1992, and the politicians essentially decided, before the science was in, that there was a massive climate crisis. And so the IPCC was given the directive to support the politicians, to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change that came out of Rio. And so, in fact, the IPCC's purpose was then changed. And it's really interesting because they say now on their documents that, in fact, their purpose is to look at the human-caused influence on climate change and how we have to stop it. But, of course, the fact is, if there was almost no human influence or it wasn't serious, there'd be no reason for the IPCC to exist. So, indeed, we have to be very suspect of everything they say.
Well, and we've seen this time and time again. You and I had a discussion here recently about, the actual numbers of what the costs are, what's driving all this, how much change would actually take place. I mean, if we had signed on, if Trump had not pulled us out of the Paris Accord, what would A, the cost to us have been, and B, what would the actual results had been? And we're talking about hundreds of millions into almost the trillions of dollars over the course of, just a 10-year period. And we're talking about if they hit all their goals, that in something like 30 years, we would see a 0.03% change in temperature.
Yeah, well,
actually,
Bjorn Lomborg from the Copenhagen Consensus Center, he's a statistician, very well regarded out of Denmark. He actually showed the analysis that shows that if every country hit their target for the Paris Agreement, and that would include the U.S., the cost to the world would be between $1 and $2 trillion per year from now until the end of the century. And by the year 2100, the change in temperature, if you believe the UN's climate models, which is a big if, but if you did, the change in temperature would be 1/3 of a degree Celsius. And so, you're talking about something in the order of $100 trillion. Unbelievable amounts of money. Far, far more than is being spent now. Right now, we're spending about $1 billion a day around the world on climate finance. And, that's an incredible amount, but they're talking about even higher amounts, Yeah. And the thing that's so crazy is this is all based on the idea that we know that the Earth has gotten warmer. We know that our CO2 has actually increased that warming, and that CO2, has risen since the 1800s. Now, those sound like really basic assumptions. In fact, even skeptics, with the exception of Tim Ball, who you had on last week, most skeptics, accept that, in fact, it's gotten warmer. But if you actually look at the data, we don't know that, because the very best part of the World Historical Climatological Network is in the United States. And in fact, a recent survey showed that only 8% of the stations have an accuracy of better than plus or minus 1 degree Celsius. So how can you claim there's a 0.7 degree increase over 100 years when 92% of the, or sorry, 92% of the data doesn't have an accuracy better than plus or minus 1 degree. So, you know, it really doesn't make any sense. And you have to think about it. We have very little data for most of the world, like in particular the oceans. There's little data for mountainous and desert regions, the Antarctic. And in fact, here's something that was in the article I sent to you. It's amazing. NASA claims that they have something like 81% of the world covered. But you have to ask them, what do you mean by covered? Well, what they mean is that there's a temperature sensing station within about 750 miles. Okay? Now, that's the distance between where I am, Ottawa, Canada, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So according to NASA, there only has to be one temperature sensing station in the whole area between Ottawa, Canada, and Myrtle Beach, and that is considered adequate to cover the climate of the region. So, in fact, we don't have the data. We don't even know that it has warmed, and it has warmed. If it has, it's a very small amount. So, it's pretty silly. We shouldn't be spending $1 billion a day on something that's so trivial.
Well, and that's the thing. Again, we're at what point, Tom, do we just start saying what this is? This is really not about fact or anything else. This is I think this is more about kind of a zealotry, almost a religion of saying we're to blame for what's going on. And we're going to believe it regardless. I mean, it feels a lot like kind of the Inquisition, whereas if you start to say no, this isn't. Oh, then you're a heretic. If you don't believe this, you're a heretic. I mean, it's like almost Galilean in proportion. No. The Earth doesn't. Yeah, the universe doesn't revolve around the Earth. The Earth revolves around the sun. Heresy, and that's exactly kind of where we're at.
Well, you'll be glad to hear that the IPCC have their next big meeting in September, only 2 hours from me in Montreal. Okay, so we're going to make a lot of noise, because if they do what they do and what they did in previous meetings, they're going to say things like warming in the climate system is unequivocal. They're going to use this word unequivocal, which they've used many times. Unequivocal means there is no possible other explanation. It is truth, in a Platonic sense. And so it's like 2 + 2 = 4. That's unequivocal. But there's nothing in science that is unequivocal. It's merely the opinion of experts based on the interpretation of the data that they happen to have. So we're going to call them on this really strongly. And it's interesting, Michael, people from the left and the right agree that the UN's first statement in the most important report they ever put out back in 2007, they say the warming of the climate system is unequivocal as evidenced by the observations, etc. But observations do not prove anything. In fact, the Greeks pointed this out a long time ago. Observations are what we happen to observe with our instruments right now, our interpretation, and our interpretation could be wrong. So even philosophers on the left of the political spectrum are saying now that the unequivocal types of statements the UN are making don't even make sense. They're not even, it's impossible. It's ridiculous. And
right.
Even fundamental things. People say, well, the CO2 has risen, to 400 parts per million. That's the highest it's been in thousands of years. Well, you know what? There's a fellow by the name of Ernst Beck. He passed away just recently. And he looked at the chemical analysis of CO2 levels in various locations around the world in the 1800s. And he found there were higher levels of CO2 in some places in the 1800s than today. Now, it's difficult to generalize that to the whole globe, but the bottom line is, when Pruitt, Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator, when they do their climate science evaluation, the red team, blue team type debate they're planning to have, they have to go back to the very beginning. Okay, how do we know that it's gotten warmer when the amount of warming is less than the uncertainty of almost the whole record? How do we know that CO2? Yeah, how do we know that CO2 has risen when we have these measurements back in the 1800s when it's higher? Obviously we have to reduce pollution and save energy. I mean, that's a good thing. But the whole idea that we understand the future of the climate so well that we're going to spend trillions of dollars trying to influence it, that is nuts.
We're talking with Tom Harris, who's the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition. Tom, again, I mean, that is nuts when you talk about being basically within the margin of error and then claiming that it's fact. Oh, it's gone up 2/3 of a degree, but it's within the margin of error, but it's a fact, so just deal with it. Again, this comes back to again, the zealotry of it, but what really kills me is that when you look at this, it appears that all these different climate accords, the panels, the Rio Agreement, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Agreement, they all basically, when you look at it and divorce it for a second from emotion, divorce it from a second from the what they is their stated goal, which of course is to fix the climate, what it really looks like is it looks like punitive measures against America and other Western powers while giving a lot of the Eastern powers, kind of free reign to do what they want. China, India, a lot of these other areas, they basically get a free pass, even though they're creating more of these supposedly, horrific kinds of pollutants than anybody else.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the base document that was signed in Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992, and that's what the Paris Agreement is based on, that's what Kyoto, Copenhagen, they're all based on it. It includes an out clause, and people don't know this. They say, the Paris Agreement applies to the whole world. Well, yes, it does, except that developing countries have an out clause. It says very, very clearly, not once but twice, that their first and overriding priority are poverty eradication and development. So what they're going to do is they're going to say, look, our cheapest form of electricity comes from coal. We're not going to turn off our coal because that's not our top priority. Our top priority is development and poverty eradication. So they're simply not going to do it. And Michael, that clause does not exist for developed countries like us. We just have to basically suffer, and that's tough.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is what they're considering to be developing nations and who are already developed nations. I mean, even China is considered a developing nation. India, a developing. Right. I mean, these are nations with huge populations, huge economies, and they're still considered under these accords to be developing nations. So they can ignore what's going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting at the Peru COP, at the Conference of the Parties, where they have these big meetings with the UN climate negotiators. They asked the Chinese delegate, would he consider some sort of redefinition, of some of these things? Like China, for example, puts out about twice as much greenhouse gas now as the United States, and yet they still have an out clause because they're considered a developing country. And you know what the Chinese negotiator said? He said, we are here to enforce the Framework Convention, not to change it.
Yeah.
So there you go. They're not going to play fair.
Yeah, no, and because they understand it. Because what it does is it puts the U.S. I mean, it really, in a lot of ways, again, divorcing us from the stated goal of it. What it really is it ends up being a hit job against the United States and other, Western nations who are literally, competitors to these other countries. They're using it as a bludgeon, economic bludgeon against us to stop us from what we're doing.
Yeah. And one of the really good things about having a Trump administration is that he's taken the lid off the Pandora's box. And so many more media are now prepared to hear the alternative points of view. Okay, now that's very, very healthy. We find here in Canada, it's very tough to get any media to listen at all. We have a liberal government. They've declared the science settled, and that is that, okay? But in the U.S., it's really great because stations like yours and various newspapers, they're opening the Pandora's box, and the environmentalists hate it.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. But here's the interesting thing to me. We're running out of time, but it's my final thoughts on this because I've seen more and more, and I've been following this for quite a while. I mean, I'm not saying that there hasn't been climate change. I'm not saying that we may contribute in some way to some of these things. But more and more we're seeing, dedicated, certified scientists who were at one point either part of the IPCC, who contributed to some of their work, or other things who are now taking a step back and going, whoa, 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 whoa. We are not drinking the Kool-Aid. We are not buying this, wholeheartedly. We're not endorsing this thing as a whole. We're saying that there's still science involved. We have a lot of questions. Some of them have become what they're, of course, calling now deniers, simply because they're asking that the scientific process be followed. And we're seeing more and more published letter scientists falling into this category of skeptics, and definitely the climate change people really hate that.
Oh, yeah. Well, Energy Secretary said point blank to the Senate committee, he said, what's wrong with being a climate skeptic? I mean, this is how science advances. This is how any field has to have people who are prepared to look under the covers. I mean, the bottom line is that if you just accept this as a given, then it's not science anymore. It's simply dogma.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. Tom Harris, again, is the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition. You can find their writings and their works up there. Tom, I really, as this next conference takes place real close to you, I want to get some details as to what it's going to be covering and what you guys are going to do to try and shed some light on this. I really appreciate you coming on the program.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Good to talk with you. Thanks so much. We got more coming up. Don't go anywhere. The Michael Duke Show, your home for Common Sense Radio. Back with more right after this.